And that really brings us to this question about different types of translations. There are different avenues that we can lean into to help us understand it and write it. And that's something that I've learned about you, that there are really two wings of translation, one being literal and one being dynamic. So what are the different types of translations, and maybe what's the right purpose for each?
Well, I think, um, by the way, there's not really a literal translation,
Mm,
um, because if you did a literal word for word translation from the Hebrew in the Old Testament or the Greek in the New Testament, it wouldn't be it wouldn't make sense in English, because
mm,
the word order in those biblical languages is different than English word order. So
mm,
so it would, I mean, if you have a Greek English New Testament in linear, for example, you try to read the English line that's corresponding line for word with the text. If you just read that line, it's hard to make sense of it, because
mm,
it's not literal. It's not really word for word. It's sort of literal and
mm,
sort of word for word. So I would say more word for word, and
mm,
maybe more thought for thought on the other side of
mm,
the other side of the spectrum.
mm,
Um, so I think the translations that are on the formal side, the more word for word, more literal translations. Um, I think the great benefit of those kinds of translation is their nearness to the original form.
mm,
So for example, I started using the New American Standard when I was 20. Somebody gave me a copy of the New American Standard. So it was published in 1970, the first version of it, and so that's the version that I had. I used it for years, and when I started teaching Greek, I just told my students to stay away from New American Standard while they were learning Greek, because it was just too close.
mm,
Um, so the translators really worked hard at maintaining that close connection to the biblical text. So if you compared that to other translations in regard to its readability, New American Standard is a little bit harder to read, because it's based on another language. It's not really based on the way the English works. So they've made an attempt to make it more readable, and the more recent versions of New American Standard have worked on that a good bit. But all of the translations on the more formal side are a little bit, the reading level is a bit higher than what you find on the other side. So
mm,
I think that's valuable. I think I encourage my students to use a formal translation as kind of the foundation of their study of the Bible. You know,
mm,
particularly if they don't know the biblical languages, to have a translation that's has a closer uh, functional connection to the original languages is important. On the other side of the practice is the thought for thought. So what those translators, I think, sometimes they get a bad rap for being far away from the original languages. But
mm,
what those translators are typically trying to do is they're trying to understand what's in the biblical text in its original language. So they're still using the Greek text in the New Testament. They're still using the Hebrew text in the Old Testament, but they're looking at, say, what a sentence says, or what a paragraph says, and then they're they're not trying to recreate the structure of the original language, but take the ideas there and communicate them in a way that's understandable for our time, or for
mm,
sometimes, a particular audience.
mm,
Um, and I think maybe the reason it's not a good thing for us just to fault them for that immediately is translators have to deal with both sides of this. So
mm,
if you've got a translator who's not focused on the biblical languages and what's in the biblical, the the Hebrew and the Greek text, if you've got somebody who's translating without understanding that, then I'm not sure we can even call it translation.
Mm.
But even people who are formal, they have to have at least an eye in the direction of the audience that they're translating to.
Mm.
So if they don't, then then the then the translation just kind of sits there and doesn't really have value. So all translators are kind of looking both directions at the same time. Here's what the biblical text says. Here's how I'm going to communicate this in this different language.
Mm.
We don't consider it different because it's ours, but it is a different language. And how do you make that transition between the texts? That's what I mean. Translation is complicated. It's not as simple as just saying, here's what it says, here's what it says. I think
Yeah.
that's what we tend to say. Why, if somebody's translating from this into this language, it should be the same thing, but it's not. Language just doesn't work that way. So if you were translating, if you just looked at, you look at two translations of Plato's work, they're not going to read the same unless you've got somebody who's relying on the translation in doing their fresh translation. Sometimes that happens in English translations as well. But I think both of these are important, and I think I tend to, if I'm talking to someone who doesn't have experience reading the Bible, and I'm encouraging them to read the Bible, I'm more likely to encourage them to use a functional translation, one of these more thought for thought translations, than a formal translation. Not because I want them not to be closer to the original language, because I want them to understand it. I want them to understand the Bible when I ask them, when they read it. And if they don't have the background that I grew up with, then they're going to struggle more with a formal translation. And
That makes sense.
And so I think both of them have they have value for us. I use a formal translation most often, but I look at functional translations as well. Particularly in my personal reading of the Bible that's not connected to a deeper study of the Bible. I do that just to try to keep my reading and studying of the Bible fresh, so that I don't get stuck in patterns that keep me from thinking through what the content really is. I think that's the value of us having translations that are not exactly the same. Is it does just force us to think, if we will let it force us to think, instead of jumping to the idea that this process must not be credible.
Sure. I think that's helpful, kind of displaying it on a spectrum and showing value to both, and how we can incorporate both, but that we should understand kind of which Bible we're reading, how to understand it, and how to study it.